Hello and welcome back to Deck Doctor. This week we are revisiting Green-Red Crackthorn. And the reason is because I have played this deck extensively over the last 2 weeks, climbing from rank 230 in God all the way up to top 10, and I just feel like it's still a strong deck. It kind of got left behind a little bit after the balance patches, but now players have experimented with some of the new ideas after the changes and returned to the good old tried and tested, that is Crackthorn. Now if you're new to this game, or maybe you've seen Crackthorn but haven't been able to play it yourself, this is a mid-range deck that relies on board control via power-ups, removal, and momentum. Basically, Crackthorn gives you tremendous momentum using its dash mechanics to play aggressively, its ability to spread power and damage across the board, and eventually you'll just run over your opponent and they won't be able to stop you. So it's very important that Crackthorn never loses board because it can be quite hard to come back. You do have removal tools available to you to kind of remove threats, but if you ever lose initiative and your opponent is collecting Faeria, it can be pretty bleak from there. So let's get into the cards and talk about how they function in this list. For our first selection of creatures, we're going to cover some of your early game plays. Now all these cards can be played turn 1, but Wood Elemental will require the Explore card, but these are great openers. Axe Grinder, playing this turn 1, it starts collecting for you, you're going to get some Faeria, and you can start marching it up the board. And of course, you're going to want those Axe Grinder spots later on to make sure you get that power up and apply a lot of pressure. Now, Sagami Warrior, again, a very great turn 1 card. It's going to collect Faeria for you. It's a little bulkier than Axe Grinder, so it doesn't die to popular removal like Flame Burst. It requires 2 Soul Drains or 2 Cypher's Wraths in the early game. It's a very good opening card, but also is very good at dashing onto your opponent's lands and restricting them from being able to make specific plays, especially if that's their only colored land at the time. So the dash mechanic is very relevant during the whole course of the game. And of course, if you get some power-ups on this guy, he does have a nice base stat line to work with, especially the Elderwood Embrace. Now, Wood Elemental is for land acceleration. This deck does require a lot of special lands, so you're going to be able to pump out that additional forest and get you that a little bit closer to a Crackthorn, but it also allows you to push lands quicker into more aggressive positions, or perhaps into the wells if you're playing a more control-orientated matchup. The Taunt is also very relevant against rush decks, especially Yellow Rush, and this card does give that deck a bit of a hard time because they usually have to run a Wind Soldier plus something else or double Soul Drain. It usually takes 2 cards for Yellow Rush to take care of it, but this card is fantastic again on turn 1 with Explore and will help you accelerate your land to get that Crackthorn down. Up next, we have some of the bigger creatures that are going to help you in the mid-game and finish off your opponent. Cypher Blood Tyrant did get nerfed, it did get bumped up to 3 mountains, but still a really strong card, and with the mobility and the power-ups of green, it does make it very deadly if it's not respected. So Cypher still makes the cut into this list just because of its power level. Now, Ground Shaker, time and time again, this guy shows up. Solid 6-drop. Deals 1 damage, which is going to help with your removal, and it's a 5/6, it's quite hard to get rid of and will stick to the board. Now, Garadan is the most expensive card, and it's kind of worth it to be honest, because if you're ever ahead and collect a lot of Faeria, it can be a very good swing card to just clear up some of the creatures in your way, and you get that 6/6 fly-in charge 2 creature that can collect for you and just cause a lot of problems on board. You could also even combo this with the Firestorm that's also in this list if you have a lot of Faeria and do a massive board sweep. It doesn't happen very often, but when it happens, it is very, very cool. Green-Red Crackthorn takes advantage of all the great removal cards that Red has access to. Cypher's Wrath and Flame Burst, we see these cards time and time again crop up in Red decks, so there's no surprise to see them here. There's a 1 of Firestorm, just in case you can't afford that Garadan, and it just gives you 2 options for potential board clears with the Area of Effect damage. Now, you don't have to use this card specifically to just wipe big boards. If you just need free damage to help you clear something, don't be afraid to invest the 6 Faeria into that, especially if it allows you to keep initiative and keep board control. Crackthorn also gets access to some of the best green cards as well. We have Runin's Guidance, which is a card I put in personally because I feel that if you split your Runin's Guidance and your Elderwood Embrace, if you go for that kind of split of power-ups, it gives you a bit more utility. Now, Runin's Guidance isn't as good as Elderwood Embrace as far as creature combat goes, but it does give you that heal, which gives you the opportunity to race your opponents, and I've used this card time and time again as a heal, just so it'll give me an extra turn to try and finish off my opponent and win those races. Now, Elderwood Embrace is, of course, the better of the two when it comes to fighting on board, and that 4 life is really powerful when combined, especially with like Sagami Warrior and Wood Elemental. It turns them into real threats, but you can also extend the power of your more expensive creatures, put them out of range of decks like Mono Red or Mono Green if they don't have access to that Voice of Truth. So power up cards are generally very powerful when you can play them from hand, and you'll be using these a lot to maintain board control. If power-ups and removal wasn't enough for you, Crackthorn also has access to mobility. I guess that's why it's such a powerful deck. It just has access to all the tools Faeria has on offer at the moment, and it's able to use the strongest cards from both green and red. But as far as mobility goes, I feel that Silent Horsemaster is probably the better mobility card that Crackthorn has access to right now, simply because it gives you another turn 1 collector if you want to start harvesting Faeria early, but also you're not required to have 3 Forest Downs to get your mobility play. So that's why I've gone for 2 Horsemasters and 1 Sagami Grovecaller. Grovecaller is more of a finisher, whereas I could use Horsemaster as more of an early to mid-game tool to be able to apply pressure to my opponent. Now, Grovecaller has some of the more flexible plays. You can place a forest somewhere where you want to teleport to, and then you can take care of a threat or push damage, whereas Horsemaster kind of demands those straight lines, and you gotta play around creatures in the way. Whatever lands you have access to, you may be like 1 land away from being able to Horsemaster across the board. So while Sagami Grovecaller is a little bit more flexible with its mobility, I feel that Horsemaster is a little more consistent just because it doesn't cost any special lands. Last but not least, we have the Crackthorn Beast. Now, I'd like to say Crackthorn Beast brings this deck together, but it kind of doesn't. It's kind of more of a finisher. It's just a great card, which doesn't need any synergies. It's just a very powerful standalone card that can help you retain momentum, give you initiative, and push damage. Now, the thing with Crackthorn, from a deck building perspective, it's a deck that's just the best green cards and the best red cards put together, and you have the Crackthorn in as your finisher when you build all those special lands. And that's what makes the Crackthorn deck so flexible. Like, the list I've given you guys is just what I've built, but you can quite simply add Virgin Forces, Grove Guardians, combat creatures. It's really up to you. You just want to build around green and red cards, what cards you want to use, and then just add Crackthorn in as, like I said, a finisher. So don't be afraid to experiment with other green and red cards if you have some favorites, and that's one of the beauties of this deck list. Very flexible as far as deck building go. Now, Crackthorn has Dash 2. It's a very important mechanic. It's going to allow you to slot into aggressive or defensive positions from where you summon him, and it gives him a bit more flexibility when being played, because you can dash onto lands that you wouldn't usually have access to, because you can only play this on your special lands. So the dash does allow it to move around the board or position itself in a much stronger place. And the damage and the power-up split, it can be really good, it can be really bad, but most of the time, Crackthorn is generally worth the play, regardless of the split, just because it's just a very powerful card, and it's going to empower your board and potentially remove threats or deal much needed damage to your opponent. And there's not really much more to say about him. I use it as a strong momentum play. You can use it as an unreliable comeback mechanic, but if you have nothing else, it's definitely worth considering if you're trying to take board back. All the pings might clear the creature that's currently double collecting for your opponent, for example. But yeah, most of the times you're going to be using this with momentum and using it to finish off your matches. Let's move on to the Mulligan. Pretty simple. I kind of covered this a little bit earlier, but you want an Axe Grinder or a Sagami Warrior as your priority, and if you have Explore, you can keep the Wood Elemental, and that gives you a turn 1 play, which means you'll be collecting Faeria as quickly as turn 2. Now, if you do find one of these openers, you can then pick up maybe something else to go along with it. Horsemaster's pretty good because if an opponent goes down the same side as you, it gives you an opportunity to have influence on the board, and you can just zip a creature up there and clear whatever Faeria Harvester they've developed. Flame Burst is just an example, so if your hand is more green heavy, you'll probably want to take an Elderwood Embrace instead. If your hand is more red heavy, you can take like Flame Burst or Cypher's Wrath. So keep in mind, whatever you choose for removal or power-ups, you need to take into consideration what you're actually opening with, because that will give you an idea on how much time it's going to take for you to be able to play these cards. Last but not least is Ground Shaker. So if you have an opening hand, you have a Ground Shaker in it and 2 other cards that are not that useful, you can keep the Ground Shaker there because it's a guaranteed turn 2 play. It's not the best turn 2 play, but it will allow you to get set up early and start collecting Faeria. But your priorities most of the time are going to be either Axe Grinder, Sagami Warrior, or Wood Elemental if you have the Explore. The next big question is, how much does this deck cost? And it does cost quite a lot actually. It's 1,605 Memoria in total, with 9 commons, 10 rares, 9 epics, and 2 legendaries. Now I do understand that that might seem a little pricey, but the one thing to consider is all these cards in the deck can be used in other decks that you'll probably build. So mono red can use a lot of pretty much all the cards here. Mono green is the same, or any dual color variant. So you're kind of investing in strong green and red cards which will be able to be used in other decks you build. Now Garadan and Cypher make up an extra 640 Memoria on top of this deck list, so I have put in changes to help reduce the cost. Now Garadan can be replaced for another Firestorm. It is the same effect, but you don't get the dragon to go along with it. Cypher can be replaced for Sagami Warrior, so this just makes your early game more consistent, but it does remove a threat for your late to mid game. But I don't mind this change too much. Basically, you're just making it better for you to get a collector in your opening hand, and I think that's very valuable when playing Crackthorn. So it may be a bit pricey, guys, but don't let that put you off. All these cards are very strong, and you'll be using them in other decks. Next, we'll take a look at the strengths and weaknesses. Crackthorn has access to the best of green and red cards. So this creates very flexible deck building, which I've mentioned already. And yeah, so you have the best power-ups and the best removal. You can't really go wrong there. Great board control, which goes back to the best green and red cards. You have power-ups, you have removal, you have mobility, you have big momentum plays like Crackthorn and Cypher. So you have access to a lot of strong and valuable tools currently in Faeria. Very hard to stop when it gains momentum. I mean, Crackthorns are a pain because they dash into really interesting positions. They remove stuff as well when they're played. They empower other guys. Crackthorn does a lot of work in this deck, and it can be very hard to stop the momentum once that Crackthorn comes down. Now, it is prone to bad top decks. There is a lot of utility in Crackthorn, so bad top decks can be pretty punishing, I think, especially if you need very specific answers. Like, say you need removal, but now you're just drawing power-ups. So I find sometimes if you're behind, it's very hard to come back because you rely on very specific things to bring you back into a match. It requires a lot of special lands, so Cypher costs 3 mountains, Sagami Grovecaller costs 3 forests, Crackthorn costs 6 lands in total, so you have to rely on building special lands in order to play these cards, which doesn't give you a lot of flexibility when it comes to developing neutrals. Now Horsemaster does take advantage of neutrals, but you do need to take into consideration how far that sets you back from playing other cards in your deck. Last but not least, massive creatures are tough to remove, so mono green has a very good time against Crackthorn. They can just power up a Verdant Force to unkillable proportions and then just storm down towards you and kill you faster than you can kill them. So mono green is definitely a big problem, and this list doesn't run Voice of Truth. I'm not a big fan of running just a one-off tech card like that, simply because I'm not running Feed the Forest in this either, so a 1/5 body doesn't really mean much to me. If this list was running Feed the Forest, then perhaps I'd consider it, but as I don't run Feed the Forest, I won't run something like Voice of Truth, so I can struggle against those big empowered green guys. But you want to be winning your games before that becomes an issue, but mono green is going to be a very tough matchup, so keep that in mind. Last but not least, we have the land placement. Now, you are going to build your first special land based on your opening creature. So if you have an axe grinder, you can play a mountain. If you have a Sagami warrior, play a forest. And then you just build special lands towards your opponent. Now, how you build those special lands will be based on what your opponent's playing and how your opponent's playing their lands. So if you do go down opposite sides, you are going to want to skip going in between the wells, and you want to apply pressure as quickly as possible. Opposite sides basically mean that you're going to be racing each other until mobility becomes a factor in slowing down each other's creatures. So build straight up the top, try and get that axe grinder spot next to the well, next to your opponent's orb if you can, but Horsemaster becomes very powerful once you get onto your opponent's wells, because you can then push damage. Now, if your opponent decides to match you, if you don't have quick land acceleration like a wood elemental, you'll probably want to go into the wells because you want to control the wells and stop your opponent from harvesting Faeria. So they're basically the two main ways that you develop lands. If you're playing against Rush, you probably just do the traditional anti-rush tactics, keep the special lands, build from outside your orb towards your wells, and just lock in your opponent's aggressive lands. And I covered this in my last video in the Guards of War, and you basically build all your rush decks, anti-rush decks, in the same way. So if you're ever playing against Rush, just stick to the same tactic. It's tried and tested, and it works very well. But that pretty much sums up land placement for this list. That wraps up this episode of Deck Doctor. I hope you guys enjoyed this refresher for Green-Red Crackthorn. This is a very solid deck and very good for climbing the ladder. So if you want to get up those ranks, I'd strongly recommend playing Green-Red Crackthorn. If you haven't already, drop us a subscribe, and then you can keep up to date of when our content goes live, and give it a thumbs up. Tell me if you like this video, or drop some comments if you have any thoughts on Crackthorn or on this build, or maybe even share some of your own builds of Crackthorn. Like I said, it's a very flexible deck. If you haven't already, check out Faeria.com/the-hub for all the latest guides, decks, and articles from the community and myself. So until next time, guys, take care and enjoy Green-Red Crackthorn.